Picture this. You're kneeling in a medieval church, surrounded by flickering candles and the smell of incense, when the priest begins explaining how sexual intercourse can be a form of divine communion. Welcome to the twisted world of medieval religious sexuality, where the same institution that preached celibacy secretly developed elaborate theological justifications for the most depraved sexual practices imaginable. The Cathars, a Christian sect that flourished in 12th century France, believed that sexual union between perfect believers could literally channel divine energy. But this wasn't some gentle spiritual practice. Their rituals involved elaborate ceremonies where couples would engage in sexual acts while surrounded by chanting congregants, all believing they were witnessing a sacred miracle. The participants would fast for days beforehand, weakening their bodies until they entered a trance-like state during the ritual intercourse. What made these ceremonies particularly disturbing was the age of the participants. Young girls, sometimes as young as 12, were selected as vessels of divine grace and paired with much older male perfecti, the spiritual elite of the sect. The congregation would watch as these children were sexually violated, all while singing hymns and praising God for the sacred mystery unfolding before them. But wait, it gets worse. The Cathars weren't alone in these practices. Across medieval Europe, various Christian sects developed their own twisted interpretations of sacred sexuality. The Brethren of the Free Spirit taught that once you achieved spiritual perfection, all actions became holy, including adultery, incest, and rape. Their ceremonies often devolved into orgies where participants believed they were literally becoming one with Christ through sexual ecstasy. Church records from the 13th century detail how these groups would gather in abandoned chapels or forest clearings, stripping naked and engaging in group sexual activities while reciting prayers and biblical verses. The contrast was jarring, holy words mixed with the sounds of flesh slapping against flesh, creating a bizarre symphony of supposed sanctity and obvious depravity. The most disturbing aspect was how these rituals targeted the vulnerable. Widows, young orphans, and women with mental disabilities were specifically sought out as pure vessels who could channel divine energy more effectively. These women had no choice in their participation and often suffered permanent physical and psychological damage from the repeated sexual trauma disguised as religious experience. Medieval authorities knew about these practices but often turned a blind eye, especially when wealthy patrons were involved. Some bishops even provided tacit approval, arguing that since the participants believed they were serving God, the sexual acts were transformed into something sacred. This theological loophole allowed countless sexual crimes to be committed under the banner of religious devotion, creating a system where rape could be rebranded as prayer and pedophilia could be disguised as divine communion. The confessional booth, that symbol of Catholic purity and forgiveness, became the epicenter of medieval sexual exploitation on a scale that would shock modern believers. What happened behind those wooden screens went far beyond simple absolution. It was systematic sexual abuse disguised as spiritual guidance, with church-sanctioned rituals that turned confession into a predator's playground. Father Benedict of Nursia wrote detailed instructions in 1203 for what he called corporeal penance, physical punishments designed to purge sexual sin from penitents' bodies. But these weren't simple self-flagellation sessions. Benedict's manual described how confessors should personally examine the bodies of female penitents, checking for signs of impurity through invasive physical contact that was essentially ritualized sexual assault. Young women confessing to impure thoughts, which could be anything from romantic daydreams to normal sexual feelings, were subjected to humiliating physical examinations. The priest would require them to disrobe partially or completely, ostensibly to check for devil's marks or signs of sexual corruption. These examinations involved touching and probing of intimate areas, all justified as necessary spiritual medicine. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and cruel. Priests would spend hours questioning penitents about their sexual experiences in explicit detail, forcing them to relive and describe intimate moments, while the confessor supposedly searched their souls for signs of corruption. Women reported feeling dirty and violated after these sessions, but they were told that such feelings were proof of their spiritual impurity and need for further treatment. But the physical violations were just the beginning. Many confessors developed elaborate penance rituals that required ongoing sexual submission. Women might be ordered to return weekly for spiritual cleansing sessions that involved increasingly invasive procedures. Some were told they needed to experience sacred pain to purge their sinful desires, leading to sessions that resembled torture more than religious guidance. The confessional records from St. Mary's Abbey in Yorkshire reveal the systematic nature of this abuse. Father Thomas kept detailed notes on over 200 female penitents, describing their bodies, their sexual histories, and the specific treatments he administered. His notes read like a predator's catalog, complete with ratings of which women were most responsive to his spiritual ministrations. Young novice nuns were particularly vulnerable. When they confessed to natural sexual feelings, the normal desires of healthy young women, they were subjected to brutal correction rituals. Some were tied to wooden crosses, while priests performed what they called exorcism of the flesh, which involved sexual touching and penetration disguised as spiritual healing. The women were told that their arousal during these sessions was evidence of demonic possession, requiring even more intensive treatment. The most horrific cases involved pregnant women seeking confession for their sin of sexual activity. Priests would perform purification rituals that involved manipulation of the woman's body, supposedly to bless the unborn child, but actually satisfying the confessor's sexual desires. Some of these rituals were so violent they caused miscarriages, which the priests then blamed on the woman's insufficient faith. Church hierarchy not only knew about these practices, but actively protected the perpetrators. Bishops would transfer abusive priests to new parishes when complaints arose, giving them fresh access to vulnerable women while covering up their crimes. The institution treated sexual abuse as a minor administrative problem rather than a serious crime, prioritizing the church's reputation over the safety of its female members. The psychological damage was immense and lasting. Women who survived these confessional abuses often developed severe religious trauma, unable to distinguish between legitimate spiritual guidance and sexual exploitation. Many became convinced that their own natural sexual feelings were evil, leading to lifelong struggles with intimacy and self-worth. The Church had turned the very concept of forgiveness into a weapon against the women it claimed to protect. Behind the holy walls of medieval convents, where women supposedly devoted their lives to chastity and prayer, lay secret chambers where the most depraved sexual rituals in Christian history took place. These weren't isolated incidents of individual corruption. They were systematic practices woven into the very fabric of monastic life, turning houses of God into institutions of sexual slavery disguised as spiritual devotion. The convent of St. Agatha in Bavaria kept detailed records that survived the centuries, providing a horrifying glimpse into their initiation ceremonies. New novices, often girls as young as 13, sent by families who couldn't afford dowries, underwent what the nuns called spiritual marriage to Christ. This ritual began with the girl being stripped naked and examined by senior nuns who claimed to be checking for signs of demonic influence. The examination was thorough and invasive, involving penetration with blessed objects while the novice was held down by other sisters. Mother Superior Gertrude wrote in her private journal about the necessity of breaking the flesh to free the spirit. Her initiation rituals involved forcing new novices into sexual acts with carved wooden crucifixes while reciting prayers. The girls who resisted were beaten and locked in underground cells without food until they submitted. Gertrude believed that by forcing these young women to experience sexual pleasure through religious objects, she was teaching them that their bodies belonged entirely to the Church. The convent's prayer chambers were equipped with devices that had nothing to do with worship. Wooden posts with carved phalluses, leather straps for restraint, and collections of objects designed for sexual penetration were all blessed by visiting priests and declared holy instruments of spiritual purification. Nuns were required to use these devices on themselves and each other during communion with Christ ceremonies held every Friday evening. But the most disturbing practices involved pregnant nuns. Yes, despite their vows of chastity, many medieval nuns became pregnant through relationships with priests or forced sexual encounters. When pregnancy occurred, the convent had elaborate rituals for sanctifying the sin. The pregnant nun would be isolated in special chambers where she was subjected to daily sexual rituals designed to purify the unborn child through her body. Sister Margaret's testimony, discovered in Vatican archives centuries later, describes being forced to participate in group sexual activities with other pregnant nuns while Mother Superior watched and directed their actions. These sessions, called preparing the vessels, involved multiple women engaging in sexual acts while chanting religious verses. The belief was that the unborn children would absorb the sacred energy generated by these rituals and be born already blessed. The treatment of newborns reveals the full horror of these practices. Babies born in convents rarely survived their first year, not from natural causes, but from deliberate infanticide disguised as religious ritual. The baptism of fire involved exposing newborns to extreme heat while nuns performed sexual acts around them, supposedly transferring the mother's sins to the child before sending its purified soul to heaven. Church records show that some convents had infant mortality rates approaching 90%. Visiting priests weren't just aware of these practices, they were active participants and often the architects of the most elaborate rituals. Father Heinrich of Cologne developed what he called the Sacrament of Sacred Union, where nuns would be paired with different priests each month for sexual encounters that supposedly represented their marriage to different aspects of Christ. These weren't brief encounters, but extended rituals lasting entire nights, with the nun required to pleasure multiple priests while reciting specific prayers for each act. The economic dimension was equally disturbing. Wealthy families paid substantial fees to have their daughters participate in special purification ceremonies that were essentially ritualized gang rape. Parents believed they were purchasing spiritual benefits for their children, while the convents grew rich from what amounted to religious prostitution. The most expensive ceremonies involved virgins being opened by blessed objects, while wealthy patrons watched from hidden alcoves. Young nuns who tried to escape or report these abuses faced brutal punishment ceremonies. They would be stripped and tied to crosses in the convent courtyard, while other sisters took turns violating them with religious objects. These public punishments served both to silence potential whistleblowers and to reinforce the message that the nuns' bodies belonged entirely to the institution, to be used however the leadership saw fit. The psychological control was complete and devastating. Nuns were taught that their natural revulsion to these acts was evidence of sinful pride that needed to be overcome through repeated exposure. Those who experienced any physical pleasure during the abuse were told this proved their spiritual corruption, requiring even more intensive treatment. The women trapped in these institutions had their basic understanding of consent, bodily autonomy, and human dignity systematically destroyed in the name of religious devotion. The medieval witch trials weren't just about religious persecution. They were elaborate systems of sexual torture that used accusations of witchcraft to justify the most depraved forms of ritualized abuse ever sanctioned by any institution. What happened to accused witches in the name of extracting confessions and purifying their souls represents some of the most systematic sexual violence in human history, all wrapped in the language of holy justice. The Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous 15th century guide to witch hunting, contained detailed instructions for what it called spiritual examination of accused witches. This process began with forced nudity, as investigators claimed they needed to search for devil's marks, supposedly supernatural signs of a woman's pact with Satan. In reality, these examinations were opportunities for church officials and secular authorities to sexually assault helpless women under the guise of religious investigation. Inquisitor Conrad of Marburg perfected what he called the cleansing ritual for witch trials in 1230s Germany. Accused women were stripped completely naked and subjected to invasive bodily searches that involved penetration of every orifice with blessed metal instruments. The inquisitors claimed they were looking for hidden demons or supernatural objects, but their techniques were clearly designed for sexual gratification and psychological destruction rather than any legitimate investigation. The water test involved more than simply throwing suspected witches into rivers. Before the public dunking, accused women underwent private preparation ceremonies where they were sexually violated with objects blessed by priests. The logic was twisted, but consistent with medieval thinking. If demons inhabited the woman's body through sexual sin, then sexual purification would drive them out. These preparation rituals could last for days, with multiple church officials taking turns violating the accused woman while she was restrained on wooden tables. But the swimming test itself was equally horrific. Women were not simply thrown into water, they were first penetrated with weighted objects that would ensure they sank, regardless of their guilt or innocence. Those who drowned were declared innocent posthumously, while those who somehow survived the rigged test faced even worse tortures as confirmed witches. The entire system was designed to ensure that accused women suffered maximum sexual violence, regardless of the outcome. The confession extraction process involved elaborate sexual tortures justified as spiritual necessity. The Spanish Inquisition developed the chair of truth, a wooden seat equipped with metal spikes that would penetrate the victim's genitals when they sat down. Accused witches were forced to remain seated on these devices for hours, while inquisitors questioned them about their supposed sexual relationships with demons. The physical agony was indescribable, and most women confessed to anything their torturers suggested just to make the pain stop. Torture chambers contained devices specifically designed for sexual assault disguised as religious investigation. The Virgin of Nuremberg, an iron maiden with spikes positioned to penetrate sexual organs, was used to extract confessions about supposed demonic intercourse. Women were forced inside these devices and slowly impaled, while inquisitors demanded details about their imaginary sexual encounters with Satan. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical torture. Victims were forced to describe elaborate sexual fantasies while experiencing excruciating pain. The most sadistic inquisitors developed purification through pain rituals that combined sexual torture with religious ceremony. Father Pedro Arbues created elaborate procedures where accused witches were repeatedly raped with heated metal crucifixes, while choirs sang hymns in the background. The contrast between sacred music and horrific sexual violence was designed to break the victim's mind completely, creating psychological trauma that would last long after the physical wounds healed. Group torture sessions involved multiple accused witches being violated simultaneously while forced to watch each other's suffering. These events were attended by church officials, secular authorities, and sometimes paying spectators who viewed the proceedings as religious entertainment. The victims' screams were interpreted as demons leaving their bodies, and their physical responses to assault were recorded as evidence of their guilt. The economic incentives made the system even more corrupt. Property seized from accused witches was divided among church and secular authorities, creating powerful financial motivations to continue the trials. Wealthy women were particularly targeted because their assets made the accusations profitable. The sexual torture wasn't just about extracting confessions. It was about completely destroying the victim's social standing and legal capacity to reclaim their property. Young girls accused of witchcraft faced specialized examination procedures based on the belief that virginity provided some protection against demonic possession. These examinations involved forced penetration to test their purity, followed by elaborate rituals designed to seal them against future demonic influence. In practice, this meant repeated sexual assault of children under the justification of spiritual protection. The trials created a climate of terror, where any woman could be accused and subjected to these ritualized sexual tortures. The mere threat of being labeled a witch was enough to silence female voices and maintain male control over medieval society. Women learned to suppress any behavior that might be interpreted as supernatural or threatening, creating a culture where female autonomy was not just discouraged, but literally life-threatening. Medieval executions weren't simply about ending lives. They were elaborate public ceremonies where sexual torture reached its most grotesque extremes. turning death into a final act of ritualized violation that satisfied both religious authorities and bloodthirsty crowds. What happened to condemned women in their final hours reveals how deeply sexual violence was woven into medieval concepts of justice and spiritual purification. The execution of Agnes Bernauer in 1435 Bavaria illustrates the horrific standard these ceremonies followed. Agnes, accused of bewitching Duke Albert III into an inappropriate marriage, was subjected to 3 days of pre-execution purification, designed to cleanse her soul before death. This purification involved repeated sexual assault by priests who claimed they were driving demons from her body through sacred penetration with blessed objects, while crowds gathered outside to listen to her screams. Executioner Hans Schmidt kept detailed records of his procedures, treating each execution like a religious ritual with specific sexual components required for proper spiritual cleansing. Women condemned to death were first subjected to what he called opening ceremonies, forced sexual violations designed to make them receptive to divine judgment. These ceremonies took place on scaffolds built specifically for public viewing, with elevated platforms that allowed crowds to see every detail of the condemned woman's degradation. The tools used in these final rituals were blessed by bishops and treated as holy relics. Wooden stakes carved into phallic shapes, metal implements designed for penetration, and leather restraints were all consecrated before each use. The executioners believed, or claimed to believe, that these implements would help purify the condemned woman's soul by forcing her to experience sacred pain through her sexual organs, the supposed source of her corruption. But the crowds gathering for these executions weren't just passive observers. Medieval execution protocols specifically encouraged public participation in the sexual degradation of condemned women. Spectators were invited to throw objects at the victim's exposed body, spit on her genitals, and shout sexual insults that were considered forms of collective spiritual cleansing. Some executions devolved into mob sexual assaults where dozens of men violated the dying woman while she was still conscious and restrained. The timing of these sexual tortures was carefully calculated for maximum psychological impact. Agnes Bernauer was kept alive for hours while crowds took turns assaulting her, all justified as necessary spiritual preparation for her journey to the afterlife. Executioners used techniques designed to prolong consciousness during the sexual torture, ensuring that condemned women remained aware and suffering throughout their degradation. Children were specifically brought to witness these executions as part of their moral education. Parents believed that watching condemned women being sexually tortured and killed would teach their children about the consequences of sin and rebellion against authority. The sexual violence was presented as holy justice, creating generations of medieval people who associated sexual assault with divine punishment and righteous anger. The religious justifications became increasingly elaborate as the practices became more extreme. Father Wilhelm of Frankfurt developed theological arguments explaining how the sexual torture of condemned women served God's will by allowing their corrupted bodies to experience divine justice before their souls faced final judgment. His sermons described the victims' sexual violations as necessary sacrifices that helped purify the entire community through vicarious spiritual cleansing. Some executions involved entire families of accused women being sexually tortured simultaneously while crowds watched and cheered. Mothers were forced to watch their daughters being violated before experiencing the same treatment themselves. These group executions were scheduled during religious festivals, turning community celebrations into orgies of sanctified sexual violence that lasted for days. The economic aspect was equally disturbing. Wealthy spectators paid premium prices for closer viewing positions during the sexual torture portions of executions. Special seating areas were constructed around execution scaffolds, creating a theater of sexual violence where the condemned woman's degradation became entertainment for paying customers. The funds raised from these events helped finance more elaborate execution ceremonies, creating a self-perpetuating system of ritualized sexual murder. The psychological preparation of condemned women involved breaking their will to resist through preliminary sexual assaults in prison cells, Guards were given explicit permission to violate prisoners before their executions, supposedly to help them accept their fate, but actually to ensure they would be too traumatized to resist during the public ceremonies. Women who had been repeatedly raped in their cells rarely had the strength or spirit to fight back during their final public violations. The horror didn't end with death. Medieval religious authorities developed elaborate post-mortem rituals that involved sexual violation of corpses, creating a systematic practice of necrophilia justified through twisted theological arguments about purifying souls after death. What happened to women's bodies after execution reveals the absolute depths of medieval sexual depravity disguised as religious devotion. The Abbey of St. Denis maintained secret chambers specifically designed for post-mortem purification rituals. Brother Marcus documented these procedures in encrypted journals discovered only in 1987 during renovation work. According to his records, the bodies of executed women were brought to the abbey within hours of death for final spiritual cleansing. Elaborate ceremonies where monks would sexually violate the corpses while chanting prayers supposedly designed to help the departed souls reach heaven. The theological justification was as twisted as the practice itself. Medieval church doctrine taught that women's bodies were vessels of sin that retained spiritual corruption even after death. Abbot Geoffrey of St. Denis argued that sexual penetration of female corpses with blessed objects could retroactively purify their souls, allowing them to enter paradise despite their earthly sins. This doctrine provided religious cover for systematic necrophilia performed by ordained priests and monks. The ritual procedures were elaborate and deeply disturbing. Fresh corpses were prepared by washing and positioning them in specific sexual positions that supposedly corresponded to different types of spiritual purification. The bodies were then violated with carved wooden crucifixes, metal religious symbols, and the actual penises of participating clergy members. These sessions could last for hours, with multiple participants taking turns while others chanted prayers and recorded the proceedings for future reference. Archaeological evidence supports the horror of these written records. Excavations at medieval monastery sites have uncovered mass graves containing female skeletons with clear evidence of post-mortem sexual trauma. The positioning of bones, trauma patterns on pelvic structures, and foreign objects found within skeletal remains all point to systematic sexual violation of corpses over extended periods. The monastery of St. Bartholomew in Cologne developed specialized techniques for preserving female corpses, specifically for ongoing sexual use. They developed embalming methods that kept bodies flexible for weeks after death, allowing for repeated violations during extended purification ceremonies. Brother Heinrich's journals describe a systematic rotation schedule where different groups of monks would use preserved corpses for sexual gratification while claiming to perform sacred duties. The most horrifying discovery came from the convent of St. Mary Magdalene in France, where excavations revealed a hidden chamber containing the remains of over 200 women and children. Forensic analysis showed clear evidence of sexual trauma both before and after death, with many skeletons showing signs of repeated post-mortem violation. Carbon dating confirmed these remains spanned nearly 300 years, indicating systematic necrophilic practices passed down through generations of religious authorities. Living nuns were forced to participate in these post-mortem rituals as part of their religious duties. Sister Catherine's testimony, found sealed in walls during 19th century renovations, describes being required to prepare corpses for violation and to hold bodies in position while monks performed their sacred duties. The psychological trauma on these women was immense. They were forced to participate in the sexual desecration of other women's bodies while knowing they would face the same treatment after their own deaths. The practice extended beyond monastery walls to regular parish churches across medieval Europe. Village priests maintained special chambers where they would store and repeatedly violate the corpses of women who died in their communities. These priests convinced grieving families that post-mortem purification was necessary for their loved ones' salvation, charging fees for services that amounted to systematic necrophilia disguised as religious necessity. The final horror is revealed in recent archaeological discoveries at Canterbury Cathedral. Excavations beneath the main altar uncovered a chamber containing hundreds of female skeletons, arranged in sexual positions, with religious objects still inserted in their skeletal remains. Carbon dating shows these remains span the entire medieval period, indicating that this practice occurred at the highest levels of the church hierarchy for centuries. The physical evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. X-rays of medieval female skeletons consistently show trauma patterns consistent with violent sexual assault, both before and after death. Foreign objects, crosses, candlesticks, and other religious items are frequently found within pelvic cavities, confirming that sexual violation with sacred objects was standard practice in medieval religious institutions. Modern forensic analysis has revealed the true scope of these practices. Conservative estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of women across medieval Europe were subjected to these post-mortem sexual rituals. The systematic nature of the evidence, identical trauma patterns, similar foreign objects, consistent burial practices, proves this wasn't isolated deviance, but institutionalized necrophilia, practiced by the medieval church on an unprecedented scale. The ultimate irony is that these practices continued well into the Renaissance, only ending when Protestant reformers began exposing Catholic corruption. The same institution that preached about the sanctity of the human body and the importance of spiritual purity had created the most extensive system of sexual violence in human history, violating women in life, death, and even beyond the grave. The medieval church didn't just tolerate sexual violence, it systematized, ritualized, and sanctified it, creating a legacy of trauma that echoes through history. These weren't aberrations or isolated incidents of individual corruption. They were the logical conclusion of a system that viewed women's bodies as objects to be used, violated, and discarded in service of male religious and sexual desires, all justified through theological arguments that turned rape into sacrament and necrophilia into sacred duty.